Okay. So, what did the workers hope to accomplish by going on strike in the first place?
Well, I'm probably not the best person to ask that because I was management and not on their side of the scale. So I think that there were several sticking points, though, in contract negotiations. And the biggest one, as I recall, what in the newsroom, because there were several unions involved and each union had different issues. But in the newsroom, I think the biggest issue for the unions was that the company was proposing that pay increases be based on merit. And traditionally, up until that point, raises had been a standard rate. So, everybody got the same thing regardless of performance. And management wanted to base them on performance and proposed merit increases. And as I recall, and union members may see it differently, but as I recall, that was the biggest issue. And so I think the union did not want to change its position on that one issue in the newsroom.
All right, so you were in management, so you were sort of against the strikers. What was your experience with that?
Well, I wasn't against the strikers. I was just, I mean, per se, I mean, I don't think that it should have been personal, although it became personal in many cases. Um, I, though, did believe in management's position on, particularly on that issue, and on others. And so, uh, you know, I hated to see it come to a strike. And I think there were people on both sides who really, that was a really awful day when they left. As I recall, it was in the evening, early evening, I can't remember what time that they walked out of the building, but there was this gigantic thunderstorm and the sky got dark and I mean it was really bizarre. It was thundering and lightning. And frankly, I was an assistant managing editor at the time. I was in charge of the night side news desk and designers. And, a lot of the people that worked for me, I considered friends and certainly colleagues, and there were tears shed even as people walked out the door. And so I think that there were a lot of people on both sides who didn't want to see it happen, but it did.
Mhm. What was the atmosphere like in the newsroom then at the time?
Well, the day that everybody walked out, it was very dire. I mean, it was like, whoa, I can't believe this is happening. And certainly we didn't have any idea that it was going to get nasty and that it was going to last as long as it did, which of course it did. And then I think there was on our side anyway, there was, well, we still have to get the paper out and what do we need to do? There were the practical issues of how do we do this with many fewer people. And so we knew that we were in for a lot of work and that the paper wasn't going to be exactly the same, of course, that you couldn't produce the entire newspaper with many fewer people. So there were a lot of logistical things. I mean, we had to get the next day's edition out, and that was sort of the immediate response. And then it was very nerve-wracking to come in and out through picket lines. And sometimes we had security guard escorts because there became in some ways a very nasty atmosphere.
And I read that there was at least a little bit of violence actually on the streets, especially in Sterling Heights, I think.
Yeah, there was, but even elsewhere, I recall one time we actually came over to Michigan State because George Weeks, who had been a columnist with the newspaper, political columnist, was being inducted into the Michigan Journalism Hall of Fame. And there was a dinner at the Kellogg Center, and there were pickets picketing outside. I can't remember how long into the strike this was, but there were actually pickets picketing outside as you drove into the parking ramp because they were ticked off that the Journalism Hall of Fame was going to induct somebody who had crossed the picket line and come back to work. And, you know, when we came back to our cars after the dinner, I had 4 flat tires. I don't think that was coincidental. Um, and there were a number of those kinds of incidents. And so I think, you know, people that at one time, I think that people, you know, when you get, it's human nature, when you get a group together, there is kind of a bit of a group think that takes over. And I think sometimes people did things that they might not have done individually. So yeah, there was some violence. And we were nervous about what would happen. Both my husband and I were, fairly high up managers at the time. And we were a little nervous about it.
Do you think the joint operating agreement
There?
between the news and the Free Press played any role in the
There?
strike?
Sorry, I lost my volume for a minute. Are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Did the joint operating agreement between the news and the Free Press play any role in the strike, do you think?
Well, I think in the sense that, I guess, gosh, some of this is so long ago, it's hard for me to remember the details, but I think probably yes to the extent that you now had, you know, the business operation being run by one company instead of two. And so it was probably easier, I'm guessing, for them to decide that they could handle a strike or take on a strike, because if you were two separate companies entirely, I mean, they were two separate companies, but if you didn't have the joint operating agreement, if you had two different business operations, you theoretically could have had one paper stay in business and the other one take on a strike. And I think, you know, that would have probably been the death knell for the striking paper. So I don't know if it would have happened if they hadn't both walked out at the same time.
Do you think the strike has weakened the position of unions at newspapers across the country?
Yes. I mean, I think that it was really an indication that I think there are a lot of factors that have happened in the interim that have probably weakened unions again, including what's happening to the industry. But even at the time, I think there were probably unions that thought long and hard about whether they wanted to do what happened in Detroit, because Detroit, I believe, and I could be wrong in this, but I believe was really the first instance where production never stopped. I mean, there was a more limited press run. It was a smaller paper. For a while, we produced a joint edition. But nonetheless, the paper continued to operate. And that was different than in many strikes before that. And so I think it was definitely a blow for newspaper unions. I think, you know, in the intervening years, because it was what, 1995, so it's been a number of years. In the intervening years, you know, as you've seen, you know, layoffs and pay cuts and a lot more concessions, I think, including, you know, I have no firsthand knowledge of what's going on there now, but in reading about the kinds of concessions the unions took this time around, I think, you know, other factors have intervened, and I think it would be very difficult to have anybody stage a strike now when you've got an industry that's, you know, struggling to keep what it's got in terms of market share.
Yeah, especially considering how far they've fallen. I think
Absolutely. I mean, we were much bigger, the news and Free Press were much bigger, of course, circulation-wise, at the beginning of the strike than they are now. And we lost quite a bit. I mean, I think both sides lost. I mean, the unions' positions were weakened, but I think the newspapers also lost and never really recovered fully from it, never got back. You know, once people lose the habit of reading a newspaper, And of course, that was just the beginning of newspapers online. I think we were one of the first papers to go online in a large part because of the strike. Um, so I think, once people lose that habit of subscribing, plus there were bitter feelings. I mean, it was a union town, a very highly Democratic area. And so, I don't think the papers ever recovered